Well, welcome. We're going to be continuing with our series in 1 Corinthians that we had somewhat before the Advent season. And today we're going to be talking about 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. And normally I do something that's called feet in the dirt, so that after I've looked through a chapter, I might want to call it practical application. And I do one or two of the feet in the dirt. Today I'm going to do three, and I'm going to switch things up. And I'm going to start with the feet in the dirt, which may or may not directly apply to 1 Corinthians, but it does apply to current events and to a lot of the questions and concerns that have been raised with me in the last 24 hours. And it just seems to me that as a pastor, if those concerns are raised as a church, we need to speak to those things. I don't normally begin my time together by a feet in the dirt segment, but I'm going to today, and I hadn't planned to do it until this morning. The morning that I usually finalize the writing and get ready for our filming. I grew up in a USA-based school, albeit it was in Congo. It was an overseas school, but it was a USA-based curriculum. The teachers were primarily from the United States. And out of that, the events in the United States were very real to me. We used to say that if the President of the United States sneezed, in those days, we would feel repercussions in the Congo. There would be reverberations from that. And in that context, I've been asking myself, how do I personally respond to the events in Washington, D.C. Yesterday? And there are two choices that I have. One, I can ignore it. After all, I'm a Canadian. It's not happening here in Canada. This is something for the folks in the States. And that kind of choice doesn't recognize that the folks in the United States are my neighbors, and not that far away, actually. If I drive an hour and a half from where I'm at right now, I'm well into North Dakota. The other choice, the one that I've chosen to take, is not to ignore it and to take a side. To not ignore it means that there's an opinion, there's perspective, there's bias, whichever word you want to choose. And so the side I've taken is reflected in the following comments. Violence of this nature doesn't just happen. There are tensions, hurts, history, personality cults, on and on, that build a context in which this kind of violence has a fertile ground to happen. And the United States, like many countries, has a long history of political violence. And for them, it goes right back to the beginnings of their country, the War of Independence, and you can go through a number of other situations. So there's little surprise to me that there's violence erupting again in the United States. And having said that, I'm a very strong supporter of nonviolence and a very strong supporter of protest as part of a democracy. Violence of this nature happens around the world. And sometimes in North America, we think it doesn't happen here, it happens elsewhere. And we tend to have a bit of a superior attitude towards the rest of the world because they're having coups d'etats and political violence over there, but not really here. It's just not really us, we say, and we fool ourselves into thinking that. In reality, I think violence is only about 2 decisions away for any one of us. It's a lot closer to the surface than we think. And we need to be aware of that. The third thing is this kind of violence, in my perspective, is directly linked to the pursuit of power. When that pursuit goes to the point where opposition is demonized, honorable discussion of differences just isn't possible. But with power comes responsibility, and violence is generally associated with an irresponsible use of power. And this perspective is one that some of you will not share, and some will disagree, but I just simply don't believe there's any Christian country in the world. The United States is not a Christian country, nor is Canada, nor should we be. Jesus never came to found a country or to resurrect a country. Mixing God and country is a recipe for disaster. To see Jesus Saves banners in the filming of yesterday in Washington, D.C., to see those Jesus Saves banner alongside a Confederate flag, alongside a political flag, alongside the United States flag, and I would add, if I'd seen the Canadian flag, is to dishonor the essence of who Jesus is. As a follower of Jesus, The next point is I'm called to pray for all leaders. And there are no exceptions to that I see in the Bible. If I dislike a leader, that doesn't give me an exception. If I disagree with the leader, I'm not exempted from that either. I'm to pray for all of the leaders and to hold them up to God and ask God to be with them and to protect them. After all, whatever's going on, God is at the very least permitted to happen. Whether or not He wanted that to happen, we do have freedom of choice as human beings. And what's there has been permitted by God. That's my perspective. Also, I live in a bit of a gray zone, a bit of a gray world, and I rarely see simply two sides. For me, my life is much more complex than that. And the events of yesterday were not events of one side against another. There were multiple situations going on. I'm a supporter of peaceful protest. My examples are Martin Luther King and Gandhi, among others. They might be my examples, but my foundation is Jesus Christ, who went to his death peacefully. But having said that, Jesus did protest. He didn't protest his own death, but he did protest corruption and the mistreatment of folks. And I think we can learn much from how he did that. So how we are supposed to be a part of a society and protest wrongs, I think the biblical mandate shows us that very, very clearly. Finally, to say you will agree and disagree with some of my thoughts, I simply put them out there in the interest of transparency and because these events mean a great deal to me. So let's get into 1 Corinthians now. And after the Christmas season in the new year, we're back together again to study the second part of 1 Corinthians. It's a wonderful letter, but the second part of it can also be seen, if we're not careful, as outlining a set of rules. And there's a temptation at times to say, just do what I say. And when people ask why, if it's children, you say, because I'm your dad or I'm your mom. And if it's in the church, we say, well, that's what the Bible says. You don't need to know why, just do it. Now, the Bible is the inspired Word of God. There's no questioning of that. And we're to follow it carefully. At the same time, I think we sell the Bible short if we don't look at the why of things. What is in the heart behind what is written in the Bible? What principle was God using in the words that are on the page? What was behind that? The Bible can handle all of our questions. Indeed, I think the Bible is created in such a way that we should be asking questions. And we can appreciate the Bible best when we do ask questions, when we put the Bible to the test. And we need to try to trust that we're going to find answers when we do that. The second part of 1 Corinthians is like that. There are some statements made, and we need to look behind that as to what is meant by that, the why of it, the heart of it. And in truth, Paul himself writes in this way. Chapter 8 and chapter 9 are sort of an extension of each other, and they're a great example of this. Paul is speaking about something here in chapter 8, which on the surface has very little applicability for us today. But for the church in Corinth, who were fresh believers, all with a past in other religions, what to do with food offered to idols was a major issue, and that was the question that Paul was addressing. Might not be so much for us today, but let's take a look at why it was so important for them then. He had been asked a question of what they were supposed to do with food offered to idols. It seems that some had said they could eat it, some said they needed to destroy it, some say it was corrupt. Should we just throw it out? Should we eat it? And Paul begins his answer in an interesting way. He begins by comparing knowledge with love. He says to us that we all have knowledge, and that knowledge can easily lead to being puffed up. Our knowledge, our head understanding, can easily lead to pride. Love, on the other hand, leads to being known by God. And it seems like our actions of love leads God to know us, to understand us, to recognize us, because we are doing what God would normally do in circumstances, and that's love, folks. The question in this is, when Jesus was asked about the great commandment, what was his response? And Paul is answering the question from that perspective. And so when Jesus said, love the Lord your God first, that's what Paul is saying. don't love your personal knowledge, as good as that might be. You love your relationship with God first, and out of that flows love. Knowledge tells us, for example, and it told the Corinthian church, that an idol is nothing more than a piece of stone, a piece of wood that's carved, perhaps. We believe we serve one God, and other gods are simply man-made. And the point here is, by choosing to follow Jesus, we have this knowledge. We know that in our heads. But not everybody is quite the same way. For those that don't have that knowledge, they make the assumption that the food that was sacrificed to idols was corrupt, and it's bad and should be destroyed. We know the food doesn't bring us closer to God, but there are those who don't know that. So what is our choice as followers of Jesus Christ? This is what Paul was responding to. What is the choice you and the church in Corinth are making on this one issue of idols? And the choice is to exercise responsibility rather than rights. We have a right to eat the meat. What is our responsibility? And why we do that? So it's that we don't become a stumbling block to someone else. Knowledge says it's okay to eat the food. Responsibility of love says not so much, because it might make somebody stumble. And if you look at verses 9 to 13 of chapter 8, it outlines it very clearly, and I'll just read those for you. Be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. If someone with a weak conscience sees you with all your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister, and by weak it doesn't mean less than you or less than me. It's simply somebody who is still thinking that through. This person for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. That's one of the impacts of that. When you sin against them in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So it becomes my sin if I put a stumbling block in front of somebody else. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will not eat meat again. So Paul is saying, if it, as much as he likes the meat and thinks that it's okay to do that, his knowledge says it's okay, his love for his neighbor says, I won't do that if it's going to cause them to stumble. So the feet in the dirt, the practical application of that, may not be eating meat offered to idols today, but it does say to me that whatever I do, I need to make sure that I'm not putting a stumbling block in the way of somebody to actually know the reality of Jesus Christ. Simple thing. My wife and I went to a wedding a while back where some guests were from very conservative Mennonite background. When it came time to dance, I wanted to. I enjoy dancing with my wife. But she said no. She was sure some of the conservative folks wouldn't understand that, and it would be a stumbling block for them. And she was right, but I will admit I was disappointed not being able to dance with her, to dance with joy in that particular wedding. On the flip side of that, on the other hand, if we let the opinions of others determine all of our actions, we will be left with little we can actually do. Jesus did challenge the traditional understanding of the Sabbath, for example. Even in the face of considerable opposition, he was accused of being a stumbling block to others by doing things on the Sabbath that were not permitted by the law. And he went back to the principle of things and explained it. He found a way to really talk with people and explain what it was. That's a little bit different than simply whether Kathy or Joy in this case, because I know her by both names, and I danced at this wedding. These are just some examples of applying the principles of what Paul was talking about. And the bottom line is we're simply to put our love for others above the rights that we feel that we have. It's not always an easy decision, but then if it was, Paul wouldn't have written this chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians. So moving on to chapter 9, it's simply an extension of chapter 8. He begins asking this chapter asking a question of freedom. But he applies it now to himself rather than to anybody else. And it's a question we each ask ourselves from time to time, and if we have not, we probably should sometime soon. As a follower of Jesus, am I free? The answer is found simply in what freedom means. So in this chapter, Paul's angry, or at least that's how it seems like to me. reading between the lines, Paul feels accused of something, and that feels like he was accused of being a lesser apostle than the others, like Peter, for example. His relationship with the folks in Corinth seemed to have been close and personal, if not fractious at times, as families often are, and he seems hurt that they, of all people, are not thinking of him as an apostle like the others, and they're not thinking that he deserves, has a right to the same kind of financial support that the church was giving to the other apostles. You, of all people, he says to them, should know better. Others, like Peter, can bring wives along on their missionary trips, and they're supported in their work by all the different churches. But when it comes to Barnabas and to Paul, you don't think that they should have that. So why is it different? And Paul gets riled up, and I like to think he gets riled up because anger and being riled up are not necessarily wrong. They're genuine emotions and feelings, and I think they came from a really, really deep space for him. He says to them, if somebody goes into business like a vineyard, shouldn't you get some grapes from that if you own it? And he goes through a number of other examples to illustrate the point. And he says to them in verse 12, if others have this right of support from you, why shouldn't we? Shouldn't I have it all the more? Because in fact, I planted the church in Corinth. Those are his words to them. And he says, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. So he's telling folks, I have a right to get financial support from you so that I can go and do the work that I'm called to do. You know, there's a place for anger, and it's an emotion that's not a sin. In this case, Paul is hurt, and he's letting his friends know. But it's not just for himself. Paul is setting the example for others who serve the church in various ways, such as missionaries, and saying they need to be supported in their work. He's teaching a principle. And while he has a right to be supported, out of love for Jesus, he says, I'm doing this freely. I'm not accepting anything from you, even if you offer it. This is a free thing I do so that you can, in my interpretation of it, so you can look at the principle of this, about what you do for others, taking me out of the equation. Notice the flashback here to chapter 8 about knowledge and love. Paul wants the love of God before anything else, and he's not willing to exercise his rights at the expense of this bit about love. And he concludes chapter 9 with the plea for self-discipline. And he talks about running the race requiring discipline, strict training, and that training isn't easy. And what he's asking folks there to do is to run through the finish line the remainder of their lives until they walk through that door of death, to do it in the right way. And that's the freedom that Paul has chosen for himself. It might not sound like a great freedom, but it's one of choice. And when you can choose certain kinds of freedom, it becomes much more than anything that's imposed on you. Now, in terms of the feet in the dirt, the application of this chapter can run a pretty serious risk of taking Paul and seeing him as self-centered, and he wants folks to see how much he's sacrificed. He's doing a guilt trip on him. You can give me money now and I won't take it. And he seems to put people on a guilt trip a little bit. I don't see it this way. Paul is human and he was hurt. And it's comforting to know that. It's comforting to know that one of the pillars of the church could feel those things. Because I think truth is that most of us will be hurt in one way or another when we share Jesus with folks. And we will likely be hurt by someone in a church if we're in a church or a faith community long enough. It's just human nature that we're going to be hurt, and we will likely hurt somebody else. We're called to live as a family, and families have both healing and hurt as a part of their simple living. And the commitment to family is simply that we work out whatever is there by being honest and transparent and moving to forgiveness and doing things differently. And I think that's what Paul is getting at here. He felt confident enough in the relationship he had with them to be honest and upfront. He was secure enough to express his emotions and thoughts, knowing the Corinthians would do the same, and they did. In fact, they probably already had, and that's why Paul was writing. Feet in the dirt simply means engaging in relationships with love and honesty. It means listening, and more than that, it means hearing, and even more, it means sharing. It means our feelings will be uplifted, and we will be hurt at times. Above all else, it means a commitment to doing things the Jesus way. And peace does not mean the absence of conflict. And I heard this today from somebody else. It's what we do with the conflict, how we handle it, bringing towards a peace. And I think that's a good place to be. The foundation on which we build our lives and relationships. It's a foundation on which we view life in general, and it's a foundation of reaching out and saying, my rights are secondary to my love for you, and let's express that honestly and openly without a lot of church language, without a lot of platitudes. Let's just get our feet down in the dirt and in the mud, and let's be real. And let's bless each other as we do that. And blessings to each other is not a big church word. It's simply we say to each other, the Lord be with you. And when I say that to you, I feel back from you the blessing saying, and also with you. And so I say, the Lord be with you in this week. The Lord be with all the folks in Washington, D.C. who are trying to handle this on every single side of the multiple sides of that. The Lord be with you all, and may God bless.